points to, I think, three big headings with regards to contemporary developments based on the framework of this panel discussion today. And I do have to sort of give a preliminary warning. I think I might be slightly overcritical of my remarks, particularly because this has not caught the attention of analysts with respect to analysis of Turkey when looking at Turkey as a model and being projected as a model into the region over the last 12 or so months. So my three basic elements of looking at the state of Turkish democracy from its internal dynamics will be limited to looking at the development of a new constitution, which this government promised, the Justice and Development, or otherwise known as AKP government, promised as one of its primary targets of achievement for the next parliament, for this current parliamentary term. This will be followed by a look at sort of judicial proceedings and the state of the judiciary in the country in terms of how it is approaching the carriage of justice, so to speak, which is one of the main problematic areas with respect to Turkey's democratic dealings. And finally, this is something more speculative and very recent, I think, in development of Turkish news items with respect to the National Intelligence Organization and the recent arrests, or intended arrests, or not even arrests, but the requirement of the director of the National Intelligence Service to give testimony to the State Prosecutor's Office. I think we have about 12 minutes. Okay. So the Justice and Development Party's tenure of power since 2002 can be regarded as nothing less than a record of electoral achievement in terms of winning 3 successive elections and increasing its share of the vote from one election to the next every single time. This has never been achieved in Turkish electoral history since the onset of multi-party politics in 1946. So to that, just looking at electoral numbers, we all know, I think, that the AKP's current electoral majority, which came in approximately 50% of the popular vote in June 2011, shocked the most speculative of journalists and analysts, mainly because we did not foresee that the AKP was going to achieve such a majority. So with respect to the unfolding Arab Spring, or so-called Arab Spring, and the shrugging of authoritarian relations or governments in Turkey's immediate region, analysts, particularly in this country, which is where it started, were keen to promote Turkey as a model, mainly as a result of its ability to infuse a modicum of Islamic identity or Islamic heritage with overtly secular government style, as well as popular governance, and so to speak, the people being in charge, all supported by a rational decision-making capacity of successive Turkish governments since the 1940s. A predictable, stable, democratic, secular model backed by strong economic growth is what makes Turkey stand out as a supposed model. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the problematics of this. I think I know Turkish analysts and Turkish foreign servicemen absolutely adore this idea that Turkey should be promoted as a wonderful model for what it stands. Aside from the arrogance of suggesting that Turkey is this shining beacon that everybody should follow, there are more deep-seated problems, and I think these should be highlighted, particularly with respect to internal dealings of Turkish democracy. And what are those? Well, as I said, the first item on this list would be the issue related to Turkey's new constitution. The 1982, or the present constitution that is in effect and force, 3/4 of which has been amended since its promulgation, mostly in the late 90s and early 2000s, is, in my opinion, a sham to what democratic ideals should represent. And Turkey has been struggling with this primary document particularly since its keen application to the European Union, where the country falls short on many aspects related to expressional freedoms, associational freedoms, and the safeguarding of human rights. As a result, one of the key promises of the Justice and Development Party, or the AKP, in the run-up to the June 2011 elections was to state, actually it was on their election manifesto, the promotion of a civilian constitution, i.e. the government's intention was to promulgate a new primary document which espoused and enshrined expressional, associational and minority freedoms that would help deliver Turkey into the second century of its existence by 2023, and radically alter and shrug off its militaristic overtones. This is something that the government will find very, very hard to achieve, as particularly because changing a constitution or amending a constitution by Turkish constitutional requirements as well as legislative requirements is an extremely difficult thing to achieve. And the AKP lacks the parliamentary majority in government or in parliament to actually enact such change without the support of opposition political parties or even a handful of members of parliament. My honest opinion as to what this constitution will represent, or the fact that it will find the light of day, is extremely well, my opinion is extremely skeptical at best. Based on the lack of parliamentary numbers that it lacks, primarily, and secondly, in terms of the actual input it will receive. What will this new constitution look like? The minister, the government spokesman yesterday, Mr. Cemil Çiçek, said he was not pleased due to a lack of public interest or associational interest, non-government interest in the drafting of the new document. And this is one problem. There is some type of public apathy towards the new document. Secondly, there is also a problem, I think, of what the government's intentions for the new constitution will look like. Aside from the window dressing that we're being presented with, saying that the new document should be about enshrining human rights and expressional freedoms, there is the lurking suspicion that the government is possibly interested in changing the governmental structure of Turkey from a predominantly parliamentary system to some type of semi-presidential system, and this raises the hairs on the back of ultra-secularists in Turkey, suggesting that the government is trying to put up or prop up the position of the president, to which Prime Minister Erdogan could possibly be elected to in the next coming elections. So that may not be necessarily about democratization or putting forward a new and bright and shiny constitution, which liberal norms will flow from, but more about strengthening the AKP's position in power, particularly with respect to the establishment of a presidential system. The second problem of Turkey's internal dynamics with respect to democracy or democratization is with respect to the role of the judicial branch in the country. And this is one of the most critical problems which the AKP is having to deal with. In its first 2 terms of office, the AKP's biggest problem was not faced from parliamentary political opposition, but really from the judiciary. I say that because in Parliament, both the main opposition party and the main opposition parties in the second term of office were too ineffectual in numbers to successfully challenge any AKP legislation. This said, the real opposition faced by the AKP came from the judicial branch, mainly from institutions such as the Constitutional Court, which not only annulled and challenged many of the AKP's most boldest legislative attempts, but also came within a hair's breadth of shutting the party down in 2007. And to that effect, the AKP engineered a supreme plan, I guess, to alter the system of judicial appointments, mainly via what is referred to as the Supreme Board of Prosecutors and Judges, which oversees the appointments of judges and prosecutors across the country. And as a result of this change, the Minister of Justice now is the permanent chairman of the Supreme Board of Judges and Prosecutors, and this allows the government a certain amount, but an influential amount, of leeway as to who is appointed as judges and who is appointed as prosecutors, and how those judges and prosecutors are distributed across the country. And as a result, the opposition sees this, or oppositionist circles accuse the government of saying that they have politicized the judiciary and that they are using the judiciary as a tool to basically get their own way in terms of eliminating judicial opposition that the government faced in its first 2 terms of office. The most physical manifestation of this, and there is no direct link between the government and the ongoings of these trials, the most physical manifestation that we'd like to point out is with the ongoing, what is referred to as the Ergenekon and the Sledgehammer trials, which are 2 sort of supposedly clandestine organizations, very non-hierarchical, loosely based, composing of individuals such as journalists, academics, military officials, all of whom have been accused of plotting in various ways to bring down the elected government of Turkey. And as a result, state prosecutors have arrested scores of people in term and charge them with bringing down the government. And if you're wondering what kind of people have been arrested, the highest arrest so far has culminated in the arrest of the previous Chief of General Staff, which has never occurred in Turkish Republican history, whether they're retired or active. And other people accused are notable Ankara columnists for the major broadsheet dailies, academics from prominent universities, students, all sorts of people. So you're talking about hundreds and thousands of people who've been arrested and placed in jail pending trial. The problem with this is that the AKP is losing leverage and credibility amongst Turkey's liberal intelligentsia, possibly, as well as a broader scope of secular mindset, which the government has relied on in building its electoral alliance in its first 2, if not 3 terms of office. And the accusation stands that the government is complicit in eliminating all forms of opposition rather than forwarding the cause of democracy. And as a result, this leads to the credibility of the AKP's democratic character. But I'll leave more room for questions at the end on that. And the last item that I would like to highlight, I guess, would be which is an offshoot of this, is with regards to the recent arrests, or sorry, the requested arrest or the requested testimony, subpoena, the closest American equivalent I can find, that was issued to the director of the National Intelligence Agency. And this, on the surface, looks sort of okay for a government agent to come and give testimony before a prosecutor, but this leads into a few further avenues which must be questioned. First of all, the National Intelligence Agency was implicitly and explicitly involved in actually holding high-level negotiations with the separatist PKK terrorist organization in order to find a credible and viable solution for the Kurdish problem. And this agency was organized directly to negotiate on behalf of the Prime Minister, Mr. Erdogan, to which the National Intelligence Agency reports directly to. And as a result, this was Erdogan's mandated plan, basically authorizing the MIT, the National Intelligence Agency, to negotiate to see if there was any credible ways of ending this problem without further bloodshed. In the last few weeks, the prosecutor's office called in the National Intelligence Agency director, Hakan Fidan, and the 2 previous directors to also come in and give testimony, because they believed that the current and previous directors may have been involved in improper dealings with the PKK. The government responded to this very, very badly in saying, no, this is not acceptable. And just this past week, the government legislated in a rapid or record amount of time to prevent basically the intelligence agency chief to give any testimony without the explicit permission of the Prime Minister. And this was signed off by President Abdullah Gül and is now in effect. The problem with this is well, you can look at this from a number of levels. And this is all speculative. On the surface level, this is a standoff between the judiciary and the Prime Minister, so to speak. This was the government. This is an executive decision taken by the Prime Minister, authorizing an executive agency, the National Intelligence Agency, to actually hold high-level talks with the PKK, and this is seen as a direct challenge to what Mr. Erdogan is doing. On a more protracted level and a more deep-seated level, and this is highly speculative, columnists are writing about this, and there is no way for me to substantiate this, and I do not claim one way or another whether what I'm saying is what is happening, but this is some of the major debates going on. This is to suggest that the AKP on the one side, which is the representative of mainstream political Islam in Turkey, and the so-called cultural side of political Islam, which is the Gülen movement, which apparently was somehow supporting or in league with the AKP over the last 8 to 10 years, have come at odds with one another. This is an extremely complicated debate, but it is there to suggest that the AKP is being challenged by the Gülen movement. Basically, they feel that the Prime Minister has gone too far or not appropriately in managing the Kurdish problem, which is mainly seen as possibly solely a terrorist problem, and it should be dealt accordingly. And as a result of that, these three issues, I think, are plaguing the hand of the government in terms of projecting itself as a positive democratic force, and Turkey's credibility, or the government's credibility, as a leading beacon of either civilianizing Turkish democracy or democratizing Turkey through projected reforms with respect to EU accession, has come to a grinding halt. And at that, I will stop. And thank you for your time.
Like Sinan, I've become increasingly frustrated with the way journalists have sort of dealt with Turkey over the last year. And it's not that I'm unimpressed with Turkish development, that I'm unimpressed with the creative ways in which Turkey is engaged in foreign policy, nor is it because I think that there's nothing to learn from the Turkish experience. But I do think that there has been a degree of sloppy thinking and irrational enthusiasm about what Turkey can offer the Middle East. I've been asked to talk about human rights in Turkey, and I have to say that my interactions with human rights workers working on Turkey internationally, human rights workers within Turkey, is that their mood is about as bleak as I can ever remember. I've even heard, and I think this is wrong, that it is worse now than it was during the military and semi-military rule in the 1980s and early 90s. This is certainly hyperbole. But I think the pessimism comes in part from the transformation that Turkey has undergone since the late 90s and the reforms that the AKP engaged in its first years in power since 2002. In other words, I think that there was enough promise in what the AKP engaged in between 2002 and you can pick your end date, 2007, 2008, and that people are sort of shocked by how badly things have deteriorated and how quickly things have deteriorated. I think that the AKP deserves some credit. It deserves credit for Turkey's wealth, for Turkey's development. I think that it's truly remarkable that effectively 100% of the Turkish population believe today that free elections are the only way to have a government. That 20 years ago was not the case. And I think that there's something that needs to be highlighted. I think that, while there's still sort of this aura of sacredness around Ataturk, and while discussion of the Armenian genocide is still subject to a massive disinformation campaign, virtually every other component of Turkish history is now openly discussed. The concept of taboo subjects in Turkey, it's not gone, but it's certainly far more constrained than at any point that I can remember. The AKP, during its first years in power, instituted far-reaching reforms that are undeniably positive. Kurdish is now allowed in limited contexts. Kurdish villagers were allowed to return to their homes with greater regularity. Citizens were able to access public documents. The role of the military in policymaking was limited. Torture has become less prominent in prisons, though it is still frequent during initial periods of arrest. And I agree with what Sinan has said about the limits of the AKP's constitutional reforms, but I still see them as more positive than negative. So in the mid-2000s, it was possible to be very optimistic about the general direction of Turkish human rights. It didn't work out that way. And it's not, as some on the American right and some old school Kemalists might have it, that the AKP are secret Islamists. After a decade in power, it's quite clear that that's not the case. And although the comparisons are intriguing, Erdogan is not Putin either. The AKP's cronyism is not comparable to United Russia's kleptocracy, and there is none of the mafia-like assassination of critics that we associate with Russia. Instead, I think the way to understand how the AKP has gone wrong is to recognize that many of Turkey's problems in the AKP era have strong Turkish roots that extend well into its Republican history, and that these roots have effectively been exacerbated by the AKP's own success. The problems of the AKP, in other words, are intrinsic to Turkish political culture and also to the mechanics of a well-engineered political machine. Indeed, I think the AKP can be seen as a victim of its own success. One can hardly blame a party in office for rewarding its supporters with positions in government. It strengthens the party's capacity to implement policy, to retain the loyalty of its base, and there is even a word for this in Turkish, kadrolaşma. It's very fundamental to the way that Turkey runs business. But it went awry under the AKP. And it went awry simply because the AKP dominated every ministry for 10 years running. And thereby, kadrolaşma stopped being giving candy to one's supporters and started being effectively the integration of the bureaucracy and the government. The AKP has also turned increasingly nationalistic and militaristic in its rhetoric. And I think this dates effectively to the AKP's success in leashing the Turkish military. It seems that in taking control of the military, it also assimilated their worldviews regarding security threats. It has become less nuanced in its approach to both international and domestic threats, and I would argue goes back to the bad old days. With regard to specific areas of Turkish human rights, I think in light of the time, I'm going to skip the stories, the material I have on women, LGBTs, conscientious objectors, though I will be happy to share that in question and answer. Rather, I want to focus on the crackdown of political dissidents of all stripes that has occurred over the past several years. And I divide this crackdown into three parts, though there's significant overlap. I won't talk a lot about Ergenekon since Sinan has done such a fine job of it. I personally believe that there was, at the heart of the Ergenekon trials, criminal activity that needed to be investigated and prosecuted. I believe that at the heart of it there was a there there. But I believe as well that the Ergenekon trials have gone badly off the rails, and that effectively it became a witch hunt. A similar sort of witch hunt, and much larger on scale, has been seen in the AKP's recent response to Kurdish political activity. Thousands have been arrested, more than 10,000. And of these, only a tiny minority are accused of violence. Instead, the overwhelming majority of those arrested are held for affiliation with the KCK, with the PKK, and even if we accept the dubious wisdom of arresting nonviolent sympathizers to a terrorist organization, Turkey's arrests have been remarkably broad, including students, human rights workers, publishers, journalists, and especially anybody associated with the fully legal Barış ve Demokrasi Party. A large number of those arrested are held in pretrial detention without access to evidence held against them, and many, including figures like Ragip Zarakolu and Bushra Ersanlı, are well-known human rights activists whose reputation for peaceful political action is clear. Finally, there are those, without being connected with either the Kurdish movement or Ergenekon, have simply been targeted for being critical of the government. Just anecdotally, I'll take the Berna Yilmaz, a senior at Ankara University. She did something that any one of my students might do when a political figure showed up on campus. She used it as an opportunity to protest, and she came in with a placard which said, "We want free education." That's what she served 19 months in prison before being released. On the not entirely unreasonable suspicion that he might throw the eggs he was carrying at President Abdullah Gül when Abdullah Gül was visiting his campus, student Yiğit Ergun is now on trial with the prosecutor asking for an 11-year sentence. I don't approve of throwing eggs at presidents. I think it's wrong. I think that those involved should be held responsible, but I think 11 years is a tad overwrought. Beyond the arrests, critics are subject to more subtle pressures. The arrests themselves create a culture of self-censorship. Lawsuits and trials are still used regularly. Newspapers have become increasingly wary of criticizing the government, and any number of major journalists, including Nuray Mert and Ece Temelkaran, have been summarily removed from their positions. Of course, government pressure is impossible in these cases to prove. But these are well-respected and popular journalists, and the one thing they have in common is a critical stance vis-a-vis the government. While one can certainly quibble with the methodology, there's a clear reason that Reporters Without Borders now ranks Turkey 148th out of 179 countries. But within this, even within the generally dismal countries of the Middle East, and none of them are ranked very high, a dozen countries receive a higher ranking than Turkey. Clearly something has gone terribly wrong in Turkey. And I'd like to close with two last points that I hope can give some small element of hope in this generally grim discussion. The first involves the case of Hrant Dink, the Turkish-Armenian journalist who was assassinated in the streets of Istanbul in 2007. The triggerman was sentenced. One other person involved was sentenced. But despite ample evidence of involvement by members of the security services, the court rejected any evidence of government involvement, and their cases were thrown out. That's the sad part of the story. The positive side of the story is that Abdullah Gül, another reason not to throw eggs at him, required that the State Audit Board look into the trial. And the State Audit Board found evidence of negligence and incompetence, and this material is going to be an important part of the appeals process. For our purposes, they also remind us that the AKP, though overwhelmingly dominant in Turkish politics right now, and I don't think we can speak of any other party in Turkey that has a reasonable chance at national office. It is a big party. It is a big tent party. There may be, once again, the possibility that the AKP will take a liberal turn, or in it fragmenting so that its liberal wing gets a louder say in Turkish politics. The last point I would like to make is that there is a widespread domestic frustration with the increasingly illiberal nature of Turkey. This has manifested itself in a whole series of new political organizations aimed at developing human rights. Moreover, and Erdogan, for all his prickly machismo, has been willing to alter course in the face of either public discontent or foreign pressure. The draft law currently under consideration regarding pretrial detentions and arrests of journalists, while far too limited, at least demonstrates that the Turkish government still is subject to pressure. The human rights situation in Turkey is certainly bleak, but there are still avenues for change if we are willing to pursue them.
Thank you.
Great things about coming last is you can kind of react to some of the things that other people have said, and I'll do a little bit of that on two fronts. Reflect a little bit on this issue of Turkey as a model. Second, talk a little bit about, expand a little bit on issues of democracy and respect for human rights in Turkey. And then third, talk a little bit about the relationship with the West and what are the effective and perhaps in some ways less effective ways for the United States, for others in the West to influence thinking in Turkey on these issues or to attempt to influence developments within Turkey. I was not one when the talk surfaced a little over a year ago about Turkey being a model that thought this was a particularly apt way of thinking about what would be Turkey's role or influence in the region, or at least not a topic that one would want to parse very deeply. Turkey's history is much too troubled to sort of wish that model on anybody, least of all in the Arab world. And I think that that's more understood, more widely understood in Turkey and probably also in the Arab world, perhaps, than it is here. What's attractive about the Turkish model, and one needs to not be too sophisticated about this, what's attractive about Turkey is it's successful. Revolting segments of the populations in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, elsewhere, Tunisia, look at Turkey and they say, we want one of those. We want what they have now. Sort of forget about how it got there or the complications in the history. They want success. They want economic prosperity. They want, as was noted earlier, a system in which elections are the way that governments get formed, not something else. And I think if you go too much beyond sort of those relatively simple things, I think the whole notion of a Turkish model gets to be really very complicated and ultimately somewhat pointless. The success that Turkey has achieved for itself, the success it achieved in the early part of the 20th century in driving out Westerners who wanted to carve up the country, making then a future for themselves, and over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, achieving a kind of astounding economic, political, social success that was not at all obvious in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, or 90s, I think is, as I say, it's something people in the Arab world look at and say, we'd like one of those. Thank you. Democracy and human rights. I don't agree with everything that my two colleagues said, but it's not a bad picture that they have portrayed, and especially not a bad picture of the way that the issues are talked about in Turkey, which I think at the end of the day is maybe the most important set of conversations that can take place on these matters. Turkey is a very complicated country. It has undergone rapid social, political, and economic change over the last 30 years. It is full of contradictions, more than most countries, in part, I think, because of the rapid changes that have taken place. And you have there simultaneously existing in society and in politics and in governance strong elements of the past, of an authoritarian, we could say repressive, difficult past, that coexist with something else that is still in the process of being formed, and that I at least would sort of divorce somewhat from the specific political ambitions of the Justice and Development Party or its leaders. In Turkey, and so that's one point. I think a second point is it's important, not as we do what Americans like to do, judge other countries, not to lose sight of the fact that in Turkey, politics, at least in the very recent past, if not today, has kind of been a contact sport. While I was serving in Turkey, the military intervened against the election of Abdullah Gül as foreign minister. Those were pretty dramatic days, and it was clearly, whatever else was going on, clearly a challenge to the right of democratically elected civilian leaders, parliamentarians, to decide who would be the country's president. Politics is a contact sport. Only a year later, or actually it was less than a year later, moved by prosecutors to dissolve the Justice and Development Party and ban 100 of its leaders from politics. This is a contact sport. The stakes very high, and I think it is a parameter through which some of the developments that have happened, some of which cause a great deal of concern, as my colleague has noted, need also to be thought about or evaluated against. which is maybe a third observation. Turkey is not a liberal democracy. It's not like the United States. It's not like Denmark. It's not like the UK. And of course, some of those countries, the United States, the UK, I'd put them in this list. There are people who have very well-founded reasons for criticizing human rights practices in this country, whether it's Guantanamo or extremely long detentions that have been relatively recently authorized under British law for terrorism suspects. Leaving that aside, Turkey isn't a liberal democracy. It may get there, but it isn't there today. Is the situation as bleak as it's ever been? I don't know. I don't think so. Not from having talked to Westerners who served in Turkey in the 80s and the 90s or the 70s or the 60s. Not from having talked. I was in Turkey last week. I didn't ask this specific question, is it bleaker now than it's ever been? But that's not what they're talking about. Yes, there are issues to be concerned about. More of the forces that want to see democratic change in Turkey, more of the forces that want to see fundamental human rights more clearly and strongly observed, more of the forces who want to see Turkey deal honestly and directly with its Kurdish problems, more honestly and directly with painful parts of its past, are associated, frankly, with the Justice and Development Party than with any of the others, or at least any of the leading parties, in particular the CHP and the Nationalists. There are, however, as I think was very clearly noted here, very serious reasons to be concerned about trends in Turkey's respect for fundamental human rights. The matter of freedom of the press is a serious one, and it cannot just be blown off, when you got 100, 200 journalists sitting in jail for things that they have written. It may well be the case that some of those individuals are in fact in jail not because of things that they are written, not because of what they've written or the views that they have, because of things that they've done. A couple hundred is a lot of people. It stretches credulity, and it for the first time last fall, first time in a long time actually, in conversations that I had with people, Turkish journalists sort of were saying, I am kind of concerned about what I write and how it will be viewed and what will happen to my job and what will happen to my reputation. And that's not unprecedented in Turkish history. Again, go back to the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s. But it's a relatively new phenomenon and not one that a lot of Turkey's friends necessarily expected to see in 2012. The problem of long-term detentions and of court cases that at least when Western jurists look at, say, the 4,000 or 5,000 pages of indictments level put forward in the Ergenekon case, I don't know what the number of pages is in the couple of indictments in the Sledgehammer case. Most Western jurists look at these and say these don't really meet our ideas about what constitutes a fair and proper case, and what a good indictment ought to look like. And I think it's right, and internal audiences as well as external audiences are right to comment on their perceptions or how they view these and contribute to a debate in Turkey on these issues. And there are other points I could add, but let me close with the third piece: the role of the West, the role of the United States on these things. And I hear I'd make 3 points. The most important and most effective drivers of democracy and of improved respect for fundamental human rights in Turkey are Turks, not outsiders. It is a free country. It is a country where, despite a certain amount of intimidation in the media, there is a pretty vibrant debate on every single one of the things that my colleagues have just referred to, and on a whole lot of other things. To the extent that Turkey is going to figure out how better to deal with these things, it will be because that conversation continues. And so one's right to be concerned about freedom of the press issues, but I can assure you, at least my perception is, that all of these issues are the subject of a lot of debate within Turkey, and it's quite visible and apparent in the media. A second important driver over the course of the last decade has been the European Union and Turkey's the reforms that Turkey undertook as part of qualifying itself to open accession talks, and then in a more limited way, the process has taken place since the accession talks began. Formal negotiations began in October 2005. The weakening, or one could say the stagnation, of that Turkey-EU conversation is one that is, in my opinion, not helpful to the further consolidation of democratic values and respect for fundamental human rights in Turkey. And as a former U.S. official, no longer strictly accountable, but I think that's one of the reasons why, in fact, one of the main reasons why the United States strongly supported Turkey's EU bid, not partly because of our concerns about issues relating to the future of Europe, but especially because of our belief that EU accession would be an important driver for a whole wide range of modernizing reforms in Turkey, including on the democracy, human rights front. The U.S. role, I think, is more complicated, and it is in the 3 years that I was there, when these tough issues came up, the battle over the election of a president in 2007, the closure case in 2008. It seemed to us at the time, and I think this is still the right orientation, that the United States government needs to be very cautious about becoming a partisan in what are, among other things, highly partisan and highly charged political battles going on about Turkey's future. They relate to issues of human rights, and where there are issues that relate to issues of human rights or Turkey's fundamental future as a democracy, yes, the United States is partisan, and we should speak up. But on the specifics, one, I think, has to be very careful. And I think that's in part because of the past, or at least the way that the United States is perceived by lots of Turks who look back on 4 or 5 decades of military intervention in civilian governance, see that the United States supported Turkey and therefore, among other things, the military over that whole time, and it colors the way that the United States voice, the U.S. voice on some of these issues is perceived in Turkey. I come back to one of the earlier things I said. What's most encouraging to me about Turkey's future, and most encouraging to me as I look at some of the problems, and there are serious ones, and I, in general, don't disagree with what my colleagues have said on them, is that Turks are discussing these. And in a context where parliamentary democracy remains reasonably firm, where the overwhelming majority of Turkish voters believe that the ballot box is the right way to solve the country's problems and to form future governments or any government, I think the wheel of politics will turn around on some of these matters and continue, I hope, to drive more liberal and more modernizing approaches in Turkey's future. I'll leave it at that.